A wet palette is arguably the most important miniature painting tool that you can have in your arsenal. I'm Khan, and this is the Wrath of Minis. Let's start with what a wet palette is. It's a palette where you put paint on, and it's wet. Hence called a wet palette. We actually add water. Effectively, it's very, very straightforward thing. It's a container, like so. It's got a sponge, like so. You add water to it, and then you have a sort of parchment paper which you apply on top, and then your paint will go on top of that parchment paper, and that's really it. That's the literal physical side of what a wet palette is. Why do the pros use them? Why do miniature painters use wet palettes? Well, there's a lot of things to sort of break down in that process, but majoritively, and probably perhaps the most important part of it all, is that the wet palette extends the life of your paint. And what I mean by that is you put paint, you apply it onto the parchment paper, and so what happens here is that the parchment paper sucks a bit of water up from the sponge underneath it and adds it into the paint over the course of time, effectively stopping the paint from drying out. So we could, and if we did, apply paint onto a dry palette, that paint would dry up very, very, very quickly. In comparison, on a wet palette, it will stay wet for feasibly hours. And so that's very, very useful when we are working with multiple colors, or we just need time to work on the model itself. Some of the most important things about, besides having that longevity when it comes to paint, is our ability to apply multiple paints down on the wet palette at a singular time. And so this kind of comes down to just almost all painting in general, where we have the ability to now start mixing paints. So I can take my two different colors, add them together, blend them together, and now I've got a new color which I can work from. And that is an extremely important tool in our painting. Adding and creating new colors is one of the funnest parts of painting in itself. Adding things, mixing things, and coming up with new combinations. A lot of paint companies out there give you a whole skew of different paints, which is nice to have, and you just want that specific color out of a bottle. But there is so much about creating nuance by mixing and blending your own colors. Not only with mixing and blending, but one of the cool things you can do as well is creating gradients, where you have one color and another color, but instead of mixing them completely together and making it one color now, you can add the two colors together almost sort of linearly or across the wet palette itself, meaning you can go from one tone to another tone and see the natural gradient that takes place between those two colors. Now you can obviously apply more colors to that, creating more interesting and varied gradients. But one of the neat things about that in specific is you can see what a gradient will look like before you even apply it onto your model. So if you're interested in wet blending, you can actually create the wet blend before you apply it to your model, which is really nice to have, because sometimes you're just not quite sure how things will turn out or if that color combination is quite right. When you start creating or mixing different blends together, and skin's a great example of this, there's lots of nuances in skin. We're not just singular dimensional in terms of the colors that are represented. What is nice about it is if you got like a general sense of like 4 or 5 different skin tones, you know, from darks to lights and maybe even a little green in there, because you'll be surprised, and you add them onto your wet palette and blending them in different like little pools, then all of a sudden you can pick the right tone or the right color that you want to apply to a certain area. And even if you mess up, then you can go backwards and apply different nuances and different tones in different sections to create more realistic skin. And this can be applied to a variety of different subjects, but the skin is a really common one for a lot of miniature painters out there, because obviously a lot of it's models with people, and skin is obviously, well, you know what I'm saying. So you have this creative control of adjusting things, going back and forth, and having nuances in different places. Very cool thing to be able to have. But perhaps the most important part when it comes to a wet palette is the ability to control the thinness of your paints. This I can't really stress enough. A lot of the time, especially with beginning painters, they're not sure how much to thin their paints by. A wet palette allows you to see it. And there is no absolute formula for thinning your paints on the varied spectrums of different paints that are out there, but learning to see it visually is an important way, or one of the best ways, to determine what your sort of viscosity is of your paint and getting it to the right thinness before you apply it to your model. And it's really where it comes down to is branching the difference between just a flat, straight layer and moving towards what would be a glaze or even a wash at some point by applying more and more water to that mix. And you can do it all on a wet palette and it stay stable and wet, so giving you, again, lots of time to be able to play with and adjust for things on your palette. Like everything in our hobby, there are a variety of choices of when it comes down to a wet palette, and which one do you want to go out and get. Now, there's a bunch of choices out there. You could also, just as a thing, build your own. So I've got a few here. Let me just start with some of these, and then I'm going to talk to you about why I picked the one that I've picked and why I use it and what I like about it. So firstly, when I first started painting, I used something like this, a Masterson's Sta-Wet Handy palette. And this really did do the job. If we look at this sponge, I do apologize, it looks pretty ratty. It looks like a rat also went at it, which don't know why, just is. And this worked well. It's just a thin sponge, and you put a piece of paper in it and it will absolutely do the trick. And this is a very inexpensive tool. You know, just not much money, which is great. You know, so if you're looking for something inexpensive, this is a perfectly acceptable and good wet palette. I ended up also acquiring something like this one here, which seems like a bit more of a travel style one. Now, I'm rarely traveling with a wet palette. This also has a chance for doing dry palette stuff as well. So if you're working with oils and various other things, this could be a nice trick. For me, however, the size of this palette is too small for me. I need more space. So this isn't quite for me either. But again, useful if you've got some dry palette stuff that you want to work with. So next up is my wet palette, the one that I made some time ago. Because a wet palette is so easy in terms of its construction, you can easily make one at home for less money than going out there and buying one yourself. And of course, then it's yours, and that's pretty cool too. So I found this container, I think on Amazon for like $10, not even. And I ended up buying this sponge. Now, if we take a look at the sponge from this one here, this is the same sort of material. Now, it's a different color. This is a sort of slightly yellow color. If you remember ShamWow, you use it to dry off your car sponge. That type of thing is great because it's a hydrophilic. It sucks up water. It holds moisture. And so it's a great sponge to then put your parchment paper on. One of the things, though, about this is that the reason why I don't use this one rather than saying the Redgrass one is because it has a very high lip, which you can see here. And I prefer not to accidentally rest my arm on the side of the wet palette, which might cause a little tip, which I do not want to have happen. So for me, I find that though it's great and it gives me lots of surface, I've ended up just sticking with the Redgrass one. But yeah, you could literally build this wet palette, I think, for something like 20 bucks. Which is cheaper than Redgrass. So the Redgrass one is, you know, it's pretty great. It's pretty great. It's really hard to knock. Comes with a good sponge. It comes with these pre-made sheets if you want to buy them. You do not need to buy these pre-cut sheets. This is pretty much a more expensive way about doing it. And actually, the fact you should just buy some white parchment paper. Don't get the wax stuff. That won't work quite as well because it doesn't allow the water to get whipped into the paint from the underside. And you also make sure that it's white because when you are working with color, you really need it to be a neutral effect so you can see the color in its truest form rather than getting it muddied up by a different color. So In certain ones, like these sponges, they're kind of yellow. You actually would prefer them to be white or grayish or neutral tone so that they don't like mess with the colors of your eyes and how they relate with each other. There's a new version of this wet palette from Redgrass, which I do not have. I just have the original version 1.0, whatever. And it absolutely does the trick for me. Obviously, as we were talking about, a very straightforward system, nothing complicated. But for me, because it's got this very low lip, I never struggle with anything about it. It's easy for just put my hand over it. I don't have to worry about touching an edge. It's got this nice gray, white, neutral effect, so I'm sure I'm picking all the colors appropriately when I'm picking them. And it also comes with a couple of attachments that you can get, like a little magnetic sidewell that you can put your inks and various other things into it if you don't want it to be on the palette. So all in all, just a very good wet palette, and perhaps one of the better ones that are out there. However, it does come at a price. It is not inexpensive for what is arguably a very straightforward thing, but there's a matter of like convenience and what you like and what you're willing to go through. So it's, obviously it's your money at the end of the day, and it depends on what your choices are and what you like. It's just that, yes, I've used this wet palette and I do like it, but I prefer this one just because of almost the straightforward reason that I don't have a lip to deal with, and that I had a hard time finding foam that was a neutral color, that was a truly hydrophilic sort of material. So, it's really little things. When we're painting, we don't want to be concentrating on other stuff besides mixing paints and painting. So for that, the simplicity of this and the low profile is my go-to wet palette. I'd also like to say as well that with these different palettes, that I'm not being sponsored in any way, shape, or form about what I think about these things. These are just my personal views, and after using them over the course of time, what to sort of look out for and what I like. When it comes to maintenance of a wet palette, well, you don't really have to do anything either. Luckily, this is one of those tools that's super great, super useful, and just fantastic to have, and also doesn't require much of you as a human being. I mean, that's how many things are like that. But when you have a wet palette, you've got your paints and you've done your session, you just close it up. However, what can happen here is they've got a lot of water and the paints can suck up that water. And if paint sucks up too much water, say like over the course of a day because you've got it completely shut, your paint can become so thin or so runny that it becomes very difficult to use. And so there is this sort of right balance that you're looking for with the amount of water that sits in the wet palette over the course of time and maintaining sort of a relative level of humidity. Now that sounds maybe more complex than I need it to sound like. So if you've got tons of water in your wet palette and you've already got paints there and you're done with your session, when you put the lid on this wet palette, perhaps you leave a little gap. So you make sure that some of the evaporation can leave the palette itself. And that will help maintain the paint that you've got. Now, I need to make a mark about that, or statement about that, is that different paints have different levels of medium in them, and some of them are heavy body versus rather than like ink, for instance. And that really does affect how it works with water. So ink's already runny. If you add too much water, they thin out too much, perhaps. And again, with heavy body paints, they may find that they're perfectly fine with a lot of water because they're already quite heavy. So it really kind of comes down to your brand of paint that you're using and what the relative humidity is that exists in the outside conditions. And so a wet palette is just something that you're going to have to grow accustomed to, as any tool that you will be. Just learn it a little bit and be conscious or thoughtful of how it reacts with the level of water that sits inside it. Also, the paint can inevitably run into the sponge. None of these things are big problems. If anything, they're just unsightly. And that's really all it comes down to. So again, a very low maintenance system that's just great for painting. So the premise of your wet palette is really straightforward. But how do you use it? Well, that's also pretty straightforward. We just, again, take our palette that we've got, our sponge, and then we're going to fill it with water. If you happen to have distilled water, this would work best because partly it stops mildew from forming. However, I say don't bother with it, just use your tap water and you should be fine. Just, clean it out ever occasionally. But again, Here you go, we take some water and we pour it into our palette. We want it to be pretty full. We just want to make sure that it's completely saturated in terms of all the water filling out all the places, so it's completely wet. And once we're there and we've got a majority of it, I think that's looking pretty good. We then take a piece of paper. Now, different companies have different sets of things. I'm going to use this one that's pre-cut, but they're all the same, really, at the end of the day. Just costs more for a pre-cut one. We're going to take this, we're going to apply it onto the wet palette, making sure that there's no air bubbles or anything like that underneath it. Now, these papers have a tendency to roll up pretty, like almost immediately. So we just want to get them straightened up. And bang, there you go. We are ready to rock and roll with our paint. So I'm just going to show you guys a quick few little demos and little things you can do with your wet palette. So as you can see, hopefully, as we take sort of the pool of the paint that we've got, we can add a bit of water to it and sort of feather it out a little bit, and we can begin to see how translucent the paint can become. And this is really one of the most useful tools in gaining control of the amount of not just the opacity of the paint, but controlling how much paint and what kind of saturation of the paint that we are utilizing. Just before we even start mixing colors together, this blue here, I can just keep pulling it out over with some water and getting to a point where it's going to start with a layer and then moving into what would be a glaze. So again, very useful tool to have. But what if you want to, say, do a blend between two colors? Well, let's say this red and this yellow. Now, red to yellow should make an orange. And let's see if we can do that. I'm going to take a bit of red here. Take some yellow. We'll go like that here. And I can just go like here. I'll just feather that way. And then clean my brush just quickly again. Make sure it's all clean. And then just bring it together. And right there in the center, we are creating a gradient. So with it, we're going to get from red to yellow, and we're going to have an orange inside. Now, this is useful as a wet blending technique, or allowing you to see how what it's going to look like before you apply it onto your model, which is very nice. So the thing about wet blending is that you need to kind of know ahead of time what colors you're going to be using to create your wet blended effect. And so if you're not fully sure how it's all going to work or what's going to happen, doing it on a wet palette first is a great idea. Another part will be blending and creating mixes. A lot of painters, they will mix multiple colors together to create the right tone for their miniature. So let's start. Let's say I start with a dark blue, and maybe this dark blue is my base color. And I'm like, okay, that's nice. Nice dark blue, and maybe I base coat my model with a nice dark blue. But I want to add a little bit of green to certain places. Maybe I'll put it over here. Take a bit more, and then I want to mix them together. So maybe I'll just do that. I'll add a little bit more blue to that mix. And now I kind of get like a nice aquamarine, which is just like what we had done here, but now we've gone to a new color, which is nice. Maybe then I take a new blue. Maybe I'm working with blue spectrum, testing that color out, and I'm going to mix this in here. Now, all of a sudden, this blue here is different than this blue, which is different than this blue-green, which is different than this dark blue, which I started with. But they're all right next to each other, so this can be very useful. Let's keep going with that. What if I want to add a bit of light blue? I can go to light blue here, mix these in together. Well, now that light blue is mostly with the mixture of those two blues that I had. Or if I take some more light blue and add it to the green mix, now my light blue is a green blue, which could be cool to be testing things with. But we can also keep going with that. What if I add a little bit of ivory or white for some, bang. Now all of a sudden I'm getting into my highlight colors. And the further I go with this white, I'm getting straight to white. Or if I go here, again. So interestingly, I'm kind of going to the same place, but with two different ways of getting there, just by utilizing a green rather than more blue. And I can change that color. Or I could start working with both of those colors and together and have them in different places. I might utilize the sort of the dark green color maybe as a shadow. This color mixing that we're doing here means that if I'm painting a model, and I was referring to it as skin previously, was that I now have all these different tones that I can pick from at any one time and use them on my model. And if I go, oh, this is a bit too bright in this area, I can take the color back from where I previously mixed and add it back to it or change it how I need to. So this color control, this painting and mixing and blending and allowing to pick certain parts of it is such a wonderful tool for painters out there. It really is, it will really up your game in terms of the colors that you're choosing, the things that you're mixing, and what your model inevitably will probably look like because you are playing around with all the colors out there. At the end of the day, it just shows you that the wet palette is an extremely powerful tool. Let me take this paint here. I'm gonna take this purple paint, like so. This paint here will dry in a few minutes time, and this one here will last for hours before it dries up. And that's really it. You know, painting minis is not a short process. It's very difficult to do it super quickly. So you really want that time. A wet palette will save you paint. It will stay fluid for longer. And because it stays fluid for longer, then you have more time, don't need to go back to this bottle to pour more out, in turn saving you paint, which then saves you money. It's only been like 5 minutes roughly, but this paint here of this purple has completely dried and is now no longer usable. Whereas the one on the wet palette, it's still totally functional and is, you know, still can play with it. And so that's really it. That at the end of the day is the part about what we need or why we utilize a wet palette. So hopefully, guys, that gave you a sense about just the importance of a wet palette and what you're going to need it for, and why you should definitely consider getting one. If it's not just buying one or building one yourself, any of those options are a great option for you. Hopefully you guys found that useful and interesting. And if you did, please press the like button and subscribe. We've got tons of more content coming your way all about miniature painting. And with that, I'm signing off. That's me. See you guys later.